Most men don't fear women. They fear being invisible while trying to be understood. They walk into conversations not to express something, but to survive something. A moment where they hope they won't be misread, rejected, or reshaped. And over time, this quiet negotiation with fear becomes a habit that silences your edge, softens your presence, and turns your voice into something barely yours. The words may sound smooth, but inside, you feel like a guest in your own mouth. You weren't always like this. Once your voice had weight. Your presence walked in before your name did. But somewhere between trying to be kind and trying to be chosen, you forgot the language of stillness. You started saying what sounded good rather than what rang true. You learned to nod, soften, adjust, to please, to charm, to survive the room. Not out of weakness, out of exhaustion, out of hope, out of trying too long to be heard in a place that never wanted your truth, just your performance. Zeno of Citium knew this kind of collapse. After losing everything in a shipwreck, he stood ashore with nothing but his silence. That silence became his foundation. He didn't rebuild his life with noise or charm. He rebuilt it with presence, with posture, with stillness. That's the voice this video honors. The voice of the man who's done performing. The one who no longer seeks approval through words, but commands space through calm. Because here's the truth. The more you try to sound impressive, the less you sound like yourself. The more you chase the right words, the more you abandon the right energy. And what women feel, far deeper than your sentence, is your self-respect behind it. She doesn't remember every word. She remembers if you flinched, if you over-explained, if you spoke like a man afraid of being misunderstood, or a man at peace with being seen. This is not a lesson in social tricks. There are no lines to memorize here. No tactics to dominate the conversation. This is a return to gravity. Conversational gravity, the quiet force that says, I am here, I am listening, I will not bend to be accepted, I will not shrink to be safe. My speech may be few, but none of it will beg. You are not here to seduce, you are here to reclaim the part of you that never needed to. Epictetus once said we were given 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we could listen twice as much as we speak. But most men have forgotten how to listen, because they never felt safe enough to be silent. Silence was mistaken for failure. Stillness was confused with indifference. And so they filled the space with noise, loud jokes, quick nods, soft apologies, emotional bribes. All of it, because deep down they feared one thing, being misunderstood again. But the man who's walked through enough fires learns this. Being misunderstood is not the worst thing. Losing yourself to avoid it is. That's the man I'm speaking to. The man who's tired of talking like a stranger to win attention that never honored him. The man who's ready to speak. Not louder, not faster, not sweeter, but real, anchored, grounded, slow. Like a man who doesn't need to convince, just exist. This is where we begin. You won't need to raise your voice, but you will need to raise your standards for what your voice represents. Not a performance, not a script, but the return of a man who's done being emotionally edited and ready to speak with the full weight of who he is, without apology, without decoration, and without fear. That man is still in you. Let's go find him. You've been trained to talk for acceptance, not taught, but trained. Somewhere along the way, every sentence became a peace offering, every tone, a bid for approval. You started adapting, not because you lacked words, but because you feared what would happen if you used the wrong ones. So you lowered your volume, smoothed your edges, filtered your thoughts, and now you sound like everyone else trying not to offend, instead of the man who once spoke with clarity. Even in silence, it's not always obvious. It's in the way your voice rises slightly at the end of a thought, as if asking for permission to finish it. It's in the way you explain a simple opinion 3 different ways, hoping one of them doesn't sound too bold. It's in the way you compliment her before you've even looked her in the eye, just to prove you're harmless. You don't mean to sound weak, but your energy has started negotiating before your words have even landed. Most men don't realize how loud their fear sounds, not in decibels, but in desperation. When you talk fast, smile too soon, apologize too often, you're not being polite. You're broadcasting self-erasure. You're showing that what you really want isn't a connection. It's not to be rejected, and women feel it. Before they hear your stories or your clever metaphors, they feel the shape of your self-worth. If your speech comes from absence, it creates distance. If it comes from need, it breeds disinterest. There's a reason Stoics spoke slowly, There's a reason their words were few, not because they lacked emotion, but because they refused to spill it for attention. When you speak with steady tempo, unhurried breath, and grounded presence, something changes. Your speech starts carrying weight. Your pauses begin to speak louder than your rush ever did. Neuroscience confirms it. People subconsciously trust slower speech. It signals composure, self-command. A man not desperate to be chosen. Think about the last time you were in a group. One man joked loudly, laughed at his own lines, filled every silence with stories that smelled of insecurity. Another man sat back, listened with full attention, spoke without rush, and didn't chase laughs. Who held the room? It wasn't the loudest voice. It was the voice that didn't flinch, the voice that didn't audition. That's what presence is, and presence is magnetic. Stop trying to be memorable. Start being anchored. Stop trying to impress with your vocabulary. Start impressing with your restraint, because here's the secret most never hear. When you speak like a man who doesn't need to be liked, you become impossible to forget. And in a world full of noise, nothing draws respect more than a man who sounds like he means every word, not to convince, but because it's who he is. She doesn't feel you when you rush toward her. She reads it as need, not presence. And need doesn't create intimacy, it creates tension. What most men mistake for enthusiasm is often received as unease, because when you try to connect too quickly, what you're really doing is demanding emotional return before it's earned. That speed, it doesn't feel courageous, it feels anxious. And anxious energy never invites trust. There's an art to pacing. Zeno knew it. His first lesson was always this: observe before you engage. Watch the sea before sailing. Read the wind before speaking. In conversation, that becomes a kind of mirror. You don't rush to fill the silence. You don't dive into connection without depth. You let her reveal herself in the pauses, the tones, the questions left hanging. And when you do speak, you speak from stillness, not from longing. Women feel emotional urgency as weight, as pressure. You think you're showing interest. She hears a man asking her to carry the responsibility for his emotional relief. The quicker you chase closeness, the more she questions why you're uncomfortable in the space between. True presence doesn't rush intimacy. It allows it. It leaves room, because it understands that depth isn't built in a moment. It's revealed in the quiet between many. It's like sound. When a frequency is too loud, too fast, too sharp, it turns into noise. The signal is lost in the flood. That's what happens when you speak to bond too quickly. You flood her with tone, intention, warmth, but it feels chaotic, not secure. Connection becomes static. She can't hear your truth because you've buried it under emotional volume. But when you move slower, when you give the moment room to breathe, something changes. She leans in, not because you're pulling her, but because you're not pushing. She feels you holding your center. She senses the difference between a man sharing himself and a man selling himself. And in that space, trust begins. Not attraction, not charm, trust. And trust is the doorway to everything. Let go of the chase. Let go of the urge to be felt before you've even been heard. Connection, real connection, starts with presence, with holding your emotion without handing it to someone else, with being the mirror, not the flood. That's not a tactic. It's a practice, one that tells her, without a word, I'm not here to take something from you. I'm here because I don't need to run from myself anymore. Every time you silence your instinct to keep the peace, you teach her something about you. Not that you're kind, not that you're safe, but that your voice is negotiable. And once a man's voice is negotiable, so is his presence. What begins as being agreeable slowly becomes self-erasure, a subtle death, the kind no one sees, the kind where the man is still in the room, but what made him compelling is not. It happens in small moments. You finish her sentences, not because you know them, but because you fear the pause. You laugh too quickly, not because it's funny, but because you're signaling comfort. You nod at opinions you don't believe. You dodge small confrontations, skip your truth, and call it emotional intelligence. But deep down, you know, you're not connecting. You're folding, and what you think is respect, she sees as absence, emotional absence, conversational absence, masculine absence, because she isn't looking for a man who agrees with everything. She's looking for a man who hasn't outsourced his sense of self, who can disagree without withdrawing, who can hold his line without raising his voice. That's what tells her. This man knows who he is. Epictetus warned of this. He said that when a man gives up his internal authority, he doesn't just lose an argument, he loses his place in the world. And that loss doesn't always show in loud failure. Sometimes it shows in how softly you vanish, how your yes becomes automatic, how your no never arrives, how your truth dies before it's even spoken. The truth is, magnetic presence isn't about charm or boldness. It's about containment, not shrinking, not overpowering. Containment. The ability to hold your emotional structure while someone else tests it, and she will test it, not maliciously, but naturally. Women test not to break, but to feel what can hold. And if your voice disappears at the first sign of friction, she won't feel safe. She'll feel alone in the conversation. Real respect is born in quiet disagreement, in the kind of exchange where your tone stays steady, your eye contact stays calm, and your words stay yours. That's not confrontation, that's clarity. And clarity is magnetic. It pulls, not because it tries, but because it refuses to leave itself. So speak, not to oppose, but to exist. Not to impress, but to remain whole. Don't trade your truth for a smile you didn't earn. Because every time you do, you don't just lose her interest. You lose a little more of yourself. She listens beyond your words, not to what you say, but to where your voice comes from. Is it grounded or seeking? Is it certain or asking for approval in disguise? And the men who speak with directional calm, those rare few who speak like they know where they stand, leave a lasting impact. Not because they say more, but because everything they do say feels like it belongs exactly where it is. Directional calm is not silence. It's not about saying less for the sake of appearing mysterious. It's about saying less because you've already listened, first to yourself, then to her. It's the difference between reacting and responding, between filling space and holding it. A man who speaks from centeredness doesn't chase rhythm. He creates it. His presence sets the pace, and the woman feels it, not in her ears, but in her nervous system. She doesn't need your words to be perfect, but she needs to feel that you mean them, that they come from a place that doesn't shift with every expression on her face. She needs to feel that if you're saying something, it's not to seduce, it's to state. She may challenge it, she may disagree, but she'll respect the direction, because it tells her, this man doesn't speak to fit in, he speaks because he knows where he's going. It's like watching a man in a room who says almost nothing, but when he finally does, everyone stops. Not because his voice is loud, but because his energy has depth. He's not loud, but he's felt. His tone doesn't ask, it confirms. His pauses aren't awkward, they're anchoring. And somehow, even in disagreement, people want to hear him. That's directional calm. It doesn't perform, it leads. Leadership in conversation isn't about controlling the dialogue. It's about being the emotional axis, about holding your shape when the topic twists, about answering slowly, not to appear thoughtful, but because you are centered. Waiting 3 seconds before speaking isn't a tactic. It's a ritual of inner alignment. You're not stalling. You're honoring the words before they come out, and that alone changes everything. The man who pauses before responding signals one thing: I am not rushing. I am not unstable. I will not betray my center for comfort. And in that space, something sacred is communicated. Not power, not dominance, but presence. A presence that doesn't ask to be followed, but is, anyway. Listening is not submission. It's not a retreat or a pause between your next thought. True listening, stoic listening, is containment. It's not about nodding at every word. It's about absorbing the full current of what's being said without losing your ground. Because the strongest man in the room is rarely the one speaking the most. He's the one who can stay still, while others try to pull him into their storm. Women don't test men through arguments. They test through emotional curves. A shift in tone, a story that veers into contradiction, a complaint with no real solution. What she's watching for isn't your logic, it's your frame. Can you hear discomfort without fixing it? Can you receive contradiction without defending yourself? Can you hold her emotion without making it about you? That's strategic containment. The ability to listen not just for content, but for context, for values, for alignment. While others chase facts, the anchored man listens for what's underneath. He isn't preparing a response while she speaks. He's registering the energy between the words, the insecurity beneath the sarcasm, the loneliness beneath the control, the honesty beneath the confusion. Containment means you don't flinch when it's heavy. You don't rush to fill the silence with reassurance. You don't over-identify or interrupt just to show empathy. You let the silence breathe, because you understand that stillness is not emptiness, it's power. And that power teaches her something. It says, I don't need to be understood in this moment. I'm here to understand you fully, and I won't lose myself doing it. There's an ancient wisdom in this, in absorbing what's being thrown at you without catching the heat, in taking emotional energy and redirecting it, not as manipulation, but as guidance, like a river stone that reshapes the current by staying exactly where it is. No resistance, no reaction, just presence. That's what listening is supposed to be, not reaction, not agreement, presence. She doesn't want your solutions. She wants to feel that her storm doesn't move you, not because you don't care, but because you're steady. You listen, not to respond, but to understand. And in that understanding, you lead, not with answers, but with calm, with space, with the quiet kind of strength that says, I can hear all of this and still remember who I am. Before you speak, you're already communicating. Your hands, your breath, your stillness, or your lack of it. The body speaks in truths your voice can't hide. And for a man who carries stoic presence, movement becomes sacred. Every gesture either leaks anxiety or anchors authority. And the man who has learned to be still, truly still, teaches something without saying a word. I'm not here to prove. I'm here to be. Zeno believed that virtue could be seen in posture before it was heard in speech. He understood that a man's presence enters the room before his philosophy does. You can tell when a man has walked through fire. His body no longer flinches at discomfort. His gestures no longer chase attention. His eyes don't dart. His shoulders don't shrink. There's no performance, just calm. Most men don't realize how much they leak through motion. The restless hands, the exaggerated nodding, the laughs that come too soon, too often, and too loud. All of it adds up. All of it sends one message. I'm not settled. I'm scanning. I'm adjusting. And when your body is constantly adjusting, your spirit looks unrooted. You could be speaking wisdom, but she can't feel it because your body betrays you. Stillness, when real, doesn't feel stiff. It feels sovereign, like a stone that speaks without shaking. It says, I don't need to convince you of my value. I've already lived it. And in that she feels something rare. Not tension, not control, but gravity. The kind of masculine gravity that calms the space it enters, not because it tries, but because it has nothing left to chase. It's not about standing like a statue. It's about moving with intention, about slowing the breath, lowering the shoulders, letting silence wrap around your words. It's about choosing when to gesture and doing it without excess. Every motion becomes meaningful, not mechanical. And when you move like that, speak like that, exist like that, she knows she's not with a man who wants to be seen. She's with a man who sees. That's what stillness gives you. It doesn't just make you look more composed. It makes her feel safer, because your stillness says, I'm not here to react to you. I'm here to receive you. And that energy, that's what she remembers. Not the clever line, not the perfect sentence, but the man whose silence taught her more about presence than anyone else's words ever could. The moment you ask if it's okay to be you, you've already left yourself. You may not say it in those words, but it shows up in the way you phrase your thoughts. Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense? You agree, right? What seems like politeness is often permission-seeking. And once you start asking for emotional permission mid-conversation, you teach her that your identity is still under review. Masculine speech doesn't beg for validation. It doesn't test the waters every time it enters a sentence. It declares calmly, from within. It's not loud. It's not forceful. But it stands. Because it comes from a place that no longer needs applause to believe itself. A place that doesn't flinch if misunderstood, and doesn't collapse if challenged. That's not arrogance. That's earned clarity. There's a difference between being open and being hollow. The man who constantly softens his edges to be accepted doesn't become approachable. He becomes uncertain. The man who says, I believe this, holds weight. The one who says, don't you think so too, leaks uncertainty. And over time, that erosion doesn't just affect how she sees you. It affects how you see yourself. Seneca said, a man who suffers before it is necessary suffers more than necessary. The same applies to speech. The man who backtracks, who pre-apologizes, who checks his tone mid-thought, suffers twice. Once in the fear of being wrong, and again in the cost of not being heard. Because every time you retreat in real time, you train her to doubt your center, not to dislike you, to feel alone with you. There's a sacred confidence in a man who speaks with emotional finality, not because he's closed, but because he's resolved. He doesn't wait for his words to be approved. He doesn't look for a reaction to decide if his truth is valid. He speaks with the quiet force of someone who has already wrestled with his thoughts before they reached his tongue. That kind of presence doesn't ask to be agreed with. It simply exists, and that existence is enough. So stop checking her face to see if your truth is welcome. Stop editing yourself mid-sentence to avoid discomfort. Say what you mean. Say it slowly. Say it like you've said it to yourself 100 times in silence. Because the moment you stop seeking emotional permission is the moment she starts feeling emotional safety. Zeno once said that the art of life is more like wrestling than dancing. Conversation is no different. It's not about choreography. It's about contact. Real, steady, grounded contact with yourself before anyone else. And like architecture, conversation must be built with weight-bearing silences, not decorative chatter, not emotional furniture arranged for applause, but structure, depth, and stillness that can carry both of you. Every time you speak from that place, she hears more than your words. She hears your history, your stillness, your edge. She feels the part of you that's no longer negotiating with your wounds. And in that, she feels safer, not because you're perfect, but because you're present, because your voice is no longer something you shape to survive the room. It's something you carry like a spine. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." The same is true with speech. The words you use, the pauses you allow, the certainty you stand on, they color the space around you. They reveal the way your mind has been shaped by loss, by silence, by rebuilding. And if your thoughts are grounded, your words will be too. She'll feel them before she even processes them. But this isn't about her. Not really. This is about the quiet return to your own voice. The one you buried under charm, under smiles, under years of emotional translation. This is about standing again, not with volume, but with gravity. It's about speaking not to be heard, but because what you have to say finally belongs to you, fully, without apology, without decoration. You're not learning to talk to women. You're learning to respect your own voice enough that it doesn't flinch when heard, that it doesn't dissolve under pressure, that it doesn't soften to fit places it was never meant to survive in. You're learning to let your silence speak. And when you do choose to speak, you do so like a man who remembers what it cost him to reclaim his tone. So picture this, a man who says little, but when he speaks, even the noise listens, not because he demands attention, but because his voice doesn't shake, his body doesn't search, his energy doesn't perform. It simply is. That's the art of conversation, not seduction, not performance, but the art of never abandoning yourself mid-sentence.